He runs the Bulletproof Musician. If you haven't seen that website and blog, it's just this wealth of information for performers. And actually, Dave's probably going to talk about it a little bit because Dave has actually taken Noah's online course. So he's got some great insight from that perspective. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Noah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Um, oh, I guess I should say a little bit of background, perhaps to get started. So yeah, so my background, like Jason was saying, is in music. I was a Suzuki kid at the age of 2.5. Learned how to bow to a D major chord that summer, and that's pretty much it. My mom calls it the $1,000 bow. But eventually I started actually being able to make sounds come out of the instrument, and probably had a pretty typical path to conservatory, like most young Suzuki kids or violinists. Summer festivals, youth orchestra, chamber music, theory lessons. And I grew up in Central Ohio, and so we, had a lot of different opportunities to choose from. I was driving up to Cleveland at some point for lessons at CIM and Oberlin, and then Cincinnati Conservatory at other times, and then drove to Chicago on weekends for lessons at some point, and then in high school I was flying to New York for pre-college at Juilliard, and at one point I had like 4 different teachers in 3 different cities in 2 different states all at the same time who we think didn't know about each other, but at least I was like 13. I don't know if I was that aware, but they probably did know something was going on. But even so, like I had different copies of the same music for each teacher so that they wouldn't see other fingerings and bowings and handwriting in there. All this to say, I had the best possible musical experience or training that I could have asked for growing up, and I was sort of lucky in that regard. But yeah, I remember getting nervous from the time I was probably about 5. Like I didn't know what it was. I just knew the sort of butterflies feeling. And I had, my fair share of memory slips and completely mortifying moments where I didn't know how I was going to ever look at these people again, ever. I also had really good days, obviously, and so that confused me for like my entire life. I was just like, why do I sometimes sound really great on stage, and why do I sometimes sound really just like a shell of myself on stage? And I asked my teachers about it, and they usually asked if I'd ever considered practicing more or at all or consistently, and they weren't wrong. Like I was never one to practice too much or diligently, but I wasn't interested in that as a solution, so I kept looking for other things. But even when I did, I don't know how many of you have had the experience of practicing more and actually sounding worse. Yeah, right. And then sometimes I wouldn't practice that much, and I'd go to a lesson and sound great, or even perform and sound great. And then the practice didn't correlate with nerves either. Like sometimes I'd practice more and be more nervous. Sometimes I'd practice less and be less nervous. And it was just a big jumble, and I didn't quite understand what led to what. And so yeah, then finally I went to Juilliard for my master's, and I took this course on sports psychology, and I'd never heard of sports psychology before. This is back in the mid 90s, and I'm just curious now, how many of you have heard of sports psychology? I'm guessing most of you probably have. Yeah, I just thought sports psychology was like therapy for athletes, and I didn't know that it was like a whole other realm of research that had been ongoing for decades, really going back until the early 1900s even. So yeah, that was pretty transformative to me. It was all stuff that answered all these questions I had about why sometimes we perform better under pressure, sometimes we perform worse, and answered questions about how to practice more effectively and practice for performance and pressure. And then, it all kind of came together because I was nearing the end of my time there, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up and had to graduate and face the world, and couldn't come up with anything. Like I didn't want to play in an orchestra, didn't want to be in a chamber music group. Even if I could win a big competition and have a solo career, that's not something that interested me. Didn't really want to teach either. So very quickly ran out of things that musicians typically do. And I was like, crap, like what have I done the last 20 years that I'm in this position? And so I was really intrigued by this class, this sports psych stuff. And then I was also in this international competition at the time, and my girlfriend was in town that summer. I didn't really have the motivation to practice still, and ended up spending too much time with her and not enough time practicing. And it worked out. We got married and have 2 kids, and things were good. So that worked out. But I was totally unprepared for this big competition that was happening in New York City. Usually it's over in Europe, but this year it's in New York. And so instead of being this anonymous like American person who no one would ever see again, like people I knew would actually see me crash and burn on stage. So I was starting to get a little bit more worried. So I was like, all right, you know what? I can't expand the amount of time I have available. I can at least make sure I go in with all these like psychological skills that I learned about over the semester. And so I really, focused on things like centering and visualization and all these other things related to focus to make sure that I'm not derailed in the moment under pressure. And I played better than I had any right to play in that first round. And so I even advanced to the second round. And in the second round, the night before, I realized that I hadn't memorized the Bach chaconne that I was supposed to play. So I was like, oh crap. But I couldn't pull out. So I, had the recording going on like 24/7, like all through the night, just hoping something would stick in my mind. And most of it did, except for one moment where I thought I was done. So I really like nailed the chord. And then halfway through the chord, I realized, wait, this is not the last chord. What comes next? And so I fumbled around for a little while and then eventually made it my way to the end. So that might have been my downfall. But in any case, I couldn't have gone any further. I hadn't learned the third movement of the concerto yet and so forth. But all this taught me, not that I didn't have to practice, but that, it's possible for me, even if I'm not 100% prepared, to play at the top level that I'm capable of playing at when I need to, if I understand how to use these skills. So that was really empowering and cool for me. And so, yeah, that was kind of the moment where I was like, you know what, maybe I'll explore this and see where this goes, even though I don't know if it's something I can make a career out of. At least it'll delay having to make a decision about what to do when I leave school by staying in school. And so, so I went to Indiana University to pursue a PhD in psychology at that point. And and so then now I'm back at Juilliard and teaching the sort of thing that I learned when I was here, and blogging, podcasting, writing, doing workshops and so forth on basically how to perform better under pressure. So I guess this is a point at which we can talk about specific challenges or frustrations in the practice room or on stage, or I can talk about some specific things related to the research on choking and what it is we can do to prevent that. I'm kind of flexible. I can whip out some slides even and some videos, or I could just answer questions in a more direct, personalized kind of way. It just kind of depends on what you guys would find most useful.
Maybe could you talk a bit about because when I did your course, you do like kind of skills assessment and all the different skills and that I think it was seven skills I think that people use to perform at sort of achieve peak performances. And I kind of had the most personally I had the most benefit from the centering aspect. But maybe can you just talk a bit how you put all of that together and maybe a bit about how centering works, maybe where it came from, and then just how it all fits in with the other skills. Maybe that would be a good topic to.
Sure. Yeah. So the fellow that taught this class at Juilliard, his name is Don Green, who I'm assuming most of you are familiar with. I mean, he's the first sports psychologist who took musicians seriously and started really trying to work with them in a more focused kind of way. And so he, years ago, working with his advisors when he was in school, put together these assessments on trying to figure out what are the key psychological skills that athletes tend to utilize. And so he did this factor analysis, basically putting together a whole mix of things that he thought hypothetically might relate to peak performance, and came up with about seven or so that seemed to predict performance. So part of it obviously is preparation, effective preparation, which kind of goes without saying, but then also the ability to manage nerves and manage activation and anxiety, arousal, that sort of thing. And then there's the ability to build confidence, not just have this sort of trait or characteristic of confidence, but skills related to building confidence. And then he called another one courage, which is kind of, to me, a cousin of confidence. Basically, the ability to take risks more freely under pressure. And then there's concentration and focus, which to me always kind of seemed a little bit similar. I mean, there are some differences, but basically the ability to quiet your mind, and then to be able to really utilize your attentional resources and focus on only the things that are relevant in that moment. And then resilience, ability to bounce back from mistakes and to kind of hang tough. Mental toughness, I guess, is the word that you probably hear most often in that regard. And so if you're able to do those things, if you have those skills developed, and all of us have various strengths and weaknesses. Some of us are already naturally a little bit better at managing nerves or being confident or staying in a positive headspace or quieting our minds or focusing. Like, we all have strengths and weaknesses, but the idea is to try to cultivate our or work on our weaknesses until we're pretty strong in all those areas. And that's where performing starts to feel a little different. It starts to feel more fun again, like it was when you were 5 years old and you didn't know anything and you're just kind of going out there and having a good time. And yeah, it can be that way. I mean, because I'm assuming, not even assuming, like I'm sure that all of you have had those moments where the stars aligned and everything came together, and you might have started out feeling a little bit nervous, but at some point it kind of morphs into excitement, right? You've had these moments, I'm sure, where you're in the zone and things are fun, and that's largely a product of your ability to do all these different things in the mental side of things. And so yeah, so David was alluding to centering, which is the name that actually Don's advisor, Robert Nidifer, gave to essentially attention control, the ability to, it's kind of a meta skill. It's about getting into a more optimal physical state, getting into a more optimal mental state, even emotional state. And you see athletes do this, but it just looks like superstition to us a lot of times. So a classic example is what athletes will do before a free throw in basketball, right? They'll like bounce the ball 3 times, and then they'll spin the ball in their hands, and then they'll shrug their shoulders, and they'll bend their knees, and then they'll shoot the free throw. It just looks like a bunch of superstitious behavior, but actually it's a carefully cultivated routine that they practice, even in practice sessions, that becomes part of their actual free throw. And that's the sort of thing that musicians can utilize too, especially like in auditions before the first excerpt and then between excerpts as part of your transition between them. And what's interesting is they found even in the NBA that those players who followed their routine, at least in these playoff series that they looked at, shot about 13% more consistently, accurately from the free throw line when they followed their routine than when they varied their routine. So if instead of 3 bounces of the basketball, it's like 5, that affected their consistency, like went down to like 71% instead of 84 on average. And so these little things end up adding up, even though they seem sort of trivial in the moment.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting, because if how many of you have read any of Don Green's books, like Fight Your Fear and Win, or Performance Success, I think is another one. They're fantastic, but his dissertation dealt with, I think it was like the San Diego Police Department, and he basically ran an experiment with law enforcement officers who were going through a training course, where they basically go into like this simulated room, and like little, you know, cardboard cutouts of like robbers and like 6-year-old school children pop out of nowhere, and if you shoot a good guy, you lose a point, but if you shoot a bad guy, then you gain a point. And so the whole thing is like quick under pressure, you know, how can you perform? And it's interesting to think about how in that industry, if you are nervous and you choke and make the wrong decision, you could kill somebody who should not be killed. And in our industry, we might, you know, flub a D flat on Bolero or something. And so it's just kind of this different level of life and death circumstance. But there's a lot of research, even on a cellular level, that shows that the stress, the psychological stress that performers experience is just as physically damaging and as physically impactful as the stress that people who, you know, are in those life and death kind of threatening situations. From a psychological standpoint, it's actually the same, like the same neurochemicals are being released, which is wreaking havoc in the same way on the body. And so we're, you know, in a way, it's, you know, you could say it's life or death, and that from a physiological way, that's not hyperbole. It actually is and can affect your body to that same level. And I just find that to be a real fascinating aspect of the importance of all of this.
Yeah, and this is something that's not limited just to athletic performance. I mean, it could be related to speaking performance, or if you have a student who's, you know, on your last nerves in a lesson and you're ready to unleash something, you know, it's about taking 5 or 10 seconds to just kind of compose yourself and be able to communicate more effectively. And I guess I should say more specifics about what these routines can look like. They vary from person to person. It might even vary a little bit even from excerpt to excerpt, depending on what the character, the mood, or the demands of that excerpt might be. But generally speaking, the research seems to suggest that there are a few key elements that are pretty useful to include in routines. And they're going to seem kind of obvious maybe, but the key is to be able to do them and do them effectively in an integrated way under pressure when those are not the kind of instinctive responses we might have mentally or physically. And so there's a couple physical elements. One, just breathing diaphragmatically, and being able to slow down your breathing and breathe really mindfully in that meditative sort of way that happens if you're in yoga or meditation. The other has to do with relaxing or releasing tension in the muscles that tend to get tight under pressure. So whether it's in your face or your shoulders or your left elbow, whatever it may be, knowing where you get tight and being able to release tension on command in that moment. And then the other two seem to be mental. One is, and musicians have talked about this for a long time. There's a great video of Leon Fleischer talking about how his teacher used to say how important it is to hear before you play. You know, that if you don't hear what it is you're going for before you play it, whatever comes out is basically an accident. And then after everything after that's kind of built on that initial accident. So having a clear concept of sound, that first note or the first couple of notes perhaps, is essentially the equivalent of what in the research is called quiet eye. They've looked at basketball players, golfers, surgeons even, and found that in the moment before executing the skill, there tends to be a moment of kind of like your eyes stop making these little tiny microsaccades everywhere and darting around, and they just get really kind of focused and quiet on the target. And then those people tend to perform better, whether it's shooting a basketball or tying a knot, than the ones whose eyes are kind of darting all over the place in little tiny movements before that moment. Seems to represent like a period of mental quiet before executing the skill. So there's quiet eye. So the musical equivalent of quiet eye is that kind of hearing the sound that you're going for in really clear detail before going for it. And then the last one comes from this interesting kind of Arizona State study of golfers, where they found that the most successful golfers, and this seemed to correlate with brain activation in the moments before hitting a putt. It seemed that instead of telling themselves what to do through kind of self-instructive dialogue, which actually is one of the things that tends to be conducive to choking, what they did is they just tried to remember the general feel of the successful putt. So instead of, oh, I should do this with my shoulders and make sure my hips are this way and then my grip is like this and, you know, my right shoulder is over here, they just tried to remember the general overall feel of a successful, smooth, easy putt. And that was more effective than trying to talk themselves or coach themselves through the technique of it. So yeah, so basically breathing, releasing tension, hearing what you want, and then feeling what you want in that moment before you play. And only really takes like 10, 15 seconds to get into that place, but seems to make a huge difference in again, the consistency at getting close to what it is that you're capable of. One quick thing I thought I'd share with you, just because it's sort of goofy, but seems to work really well. It comes from a singer. The singer shared this with me because I think for the singer, there was a tendency, because diaphragmatic breathing was so kind of central to technique, there was a tendency to overthink some of the elements of the breathing, which then was more conducive to not being able to breathe deeply and freely and easily. And so this visual, the metaphor that the singer described was, and you can try this now actually, it's sort of interesting. So the idea is to imagine you're wearing a belt that was gifted to you by maybe some cannibal, right? So you're visiting an island of cannibals and they have a bunch of spare noses lying around. So they just kind of, you know, sew together a bunch of noses into this belt for you. So you're just wearing this belt of noses all around your stomach, your sides, your back. A little weird, obviously, but the idea is to imagine that as you inhale, you're inhaling through the noses in this belt instead of the nose on your face. So just try for a moment. Just imagine, you know, you're wearing this belt all around your waist. And then take some deep breaths in through each of those noses, around your sides, around your back, on your front. Does that feel different at all, or does that feel like it's helping you breathe without thinking about breathing quite so much. Yeah, it's sort of a goofy metaphor, but a lot of times these sort of analogies are more useful to achieving the end goal than actually thinking about the mechanism itself. Sort of like I remember reading in Tennis Magazine when I was in middle school this article about how to hit through the ball more effectively instead of kind of hitting up too much, because topspin was starting to get super popular. And so the idea was to imagine that there's a bunch of like Coke bottles on your dining table, and you have your tennis racket. You just want to like clear your table as quickly as possible or effectively as possible. So you're just going to get your tennis racket and imagine, sweeping across the table, through all the Coke bottles and getting the Coke bottles to go off the other end of the table. And that's sort of like a visual that you can use when you're on the court to kind of imagine every shot that you're hitting is like pushing those Coke bottles off the table, so that you end up following through the ball a little bit more effectively than if you're not thinking in those terms. So this kind of belt of noses is an example of that sort of analogical way of executing motor skills.
We have a question in the chat from Tyler. I'll read it here. And there's another topic I wanted to talk about. We'll answer his question first, though. He says, "I'd love to know more about mental practice. I find that when I get fatigued, I still keep practicing and not getting any better. I feel like I need to spend more focused time mentally building musical skills. Thoughts?" So kind of a topic about mental practice and all of that, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, mental practice and visualization has been researched quite a bit, and I think there was this Canadian study. They looked at the Olympic trials and the Olympic team, and they found that the athletes who they were curious, what is it that separates the athletes who get onto the Olympic team versus those who are at the trials but don't make it onto the team? And it seemed like the one single factor that was most predictive was their systematic and regular use of visualization. And so I tend to think of visualization as having two different elements of it. One is mental practice. The other one I think of as mental rehearsal. Mental rehearsal being basically doing a performance of something in your mind. So this is where you'll hear of musicians sometimes envisioning the entire audition day experience before they go there. They imagine themselves walking into the building and through all the warm-up stuff and then eventually on stage and through each of their excerpts and so forth. And you'll hear stories about race car drivers, Olympic divers who will go through their entire routine in painstaking detail, which has some value in itself in terms of pre-experiencing what it is that you want to have happen and getting better at being able to recall those. And if I forget, I'd like to come back to that in a second, because there's some concrete exercises that are useful to engage in that don't take a ton of time. But I think of that as being different than mental practice, which is where you might take a selected passage or even just a few notes and then practice troubleshooting those in your head, just in your imagination, as you would if you were playing for real. And I don't know that violinists or string players do a ton of this, because I think because they can play for so much longer without worrying about injury, I think they just do, and they just problem solve on their instrument. But if you're a singer or a brass player and fatigue becomes an issue, I think you can alternate between mental practice and actual practice repetitions to kind of save yourself a little bit. So this would be something like, I forget where this exercise came from. It's probably in a book somewhere, but I call them 21s because it's alternating a single actual repetition on your instrument, just to kind of see how things feel, how things sound, and then doing like 7 mental repetitions of that same thing. So if you're trying to troubleshoot it, you can troubleshoot some of the details in your imagination. Just kind of imagine doing multiple repetitions of it in your head until it sounds right in your head, and then try it again physically. And then see if it's gotten better, see if those adjustments that you made in your head translate into the kinds of results that you want in real life. And then you do another 7 or so mental repetitions, and then another physical repetition, and then I've lost count. Maybe you do another 7, and then one last physical repetition. And 7's completely arbitrary. You might just do 3 repetitions in between physical repetitions. But the idea is to alternate between physical and mental repetitions to hopefully try to get closer to where it is that you want to be with your playing in fewer physical repetitions. And the violinist Pamela Frank actually, I swear she said this. I'll have to look it up, but I swear she said that you should give yourself, just a limited number of repetitions, even on the violin, to solve a problem before forcing yourself to move on and then maybe come back to it later. But in terms of injury prevention for her, she had career-threatening injury situation. She couldn't afford to play extra notes that weren't necessary to be played. So it meant really identifying what are the biggest things that I really need to solve or troubleshoot, and then giving yourself limited opportunities to solve that in that one setting, so that you don't end up kind of using up repetitions or notes that could lead to injury, and especially when you're trying to recover.
One of the interesting things about COVID-19 is that I think many of us are going to feel the challenge of having more limited infrastructural resources. Like the time that we spend in a certain room at a certain time is going to be much more monitored and much more limited. We might be dealing with situations where you get one in-person lesson and then you have 2 weeks of online lessons and then you get one in-person lesson, or you can only be in that classroom from such and such a time to such and such a time, and then it's got to get cleaned before the next group comes in. So things are going to start, the amount of time that we're going to have to do repetitions is going to become a premium, I think more so than it was for a lot of people. And I wonder if one of the silver linings of that is, if you only have enough time to run something or to play something a couple of times, how can you make that count? And how can you get the best out of that? And I wonder if this might be a wonderful opportunity systemically for our industry to embrace more of this mental practice and mental rehearsal, because you can do, infinite repetitions if you wanted to, although diminishing returns, I get it, but you can do a lot of mental work, productive work out without the need of a big room or without the need of other people, and I wonder if that's going to be kind of embraced differently at this time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that actually. And the other thing too that Pam talked about was, just pick 3 problems to find solutions to in your practice session and solve those problems permanently. If you solve those problems permanently, you're much better ahead than if you like semi permanently solve 10, 12, 20 problems, but they keep coming back. And so I think that kind of speaks maybe to Shelby's comment about, it being difficult to get students to think in between repetitions. And they've looked at that. It's called the intertrial interval. So like between free throws or between repetitions of a skill, what's the optimal amount of time to like wait? And it's not about waiting. It's actually about the thought process, I think, that's possible between repetitions. But they found that, the people who took, let's see if I can get the numbers right. The people who took, I think, like a second or less than 5 seconds between repetitions actually did not progress as quickly as people who took between 5 and 20 seconds between repetitions. And, of course, at some point, if you're just waiting 20 seconds between repetitions for the sake of waiting 20 seconds and count to 20, that's not useful. And it also takes you more time to do a certain number of repetitions. But yeah, the idea is, I think if you, have 5 seconds between repetitions, it gives you a chance to kind of reflect on what just happened and make adjustments and then try it again. And there's actually something that comes from the computer science world that might be helpful with this, especially for students perhaps. You can try this in lessons and see if it does anything, but people seem to like it. The idea is there's a story about this computer programmer who would pull a rubber ducky out of his bag and go through his code line by line, explaining to the rubber ducky what every line of code did, just to kind of make sure he's on top of everything and kind of find bugs in the code. And that same sort of thing is possible with us practicing. So if you get like a little action figure or Optimus Prime, or wow, Jason's really good at finding this stuff quickly. Look at you with your Google ninja skills. So an old Transformer or like a Beanie Buddy or Beanie Baby, whatever they were called, or just something lying around, have that next to your stand or in your case. And as you're practicing, when you hear something you don't like, just stop and describe to your Beanie Baby, okay, what just happened? This is what happened. And then you start explaining, okay, I think that happened because of X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't know anything about trombone, but it's like, I think that shift was a little bit flat, or that note was a little bit flat because, I didn't get my elbow around soon enough. My hand frame was still kind of in the old position. My thumb hadn't released yet. And I think I need to release my thumb first, maybe get my elbow around and adjust before I make that shift to make sure the shift is in rhythm instead of kind of jerky. And then, explain to your BNB, okay, so, this time I'm going to focus on the thumb first. I think I'm going to release my thumb and see what happens. And then you do that again. And so the key seems to be verbalizing these things externally. So they're not just this sort of vague kind of semi-conscious thought in your head that you make an automatic instinctive adjustment to, but it's like a concrete analysis of what the problem is, what caused the problem, and what the solution might be, which kind of then gets you into naturally engaging in this sort of deliberate practice process that can otherwise seem maybe a little bit abstract or a lot of work, but something about having this little character, this practice buddy that you're talking to and verbalizing things out loud seems to make that process a little bit more instinctive and natural and funner and easier. So that might be a way of, instead of trying to get them to think between repetitions, if you get them to do that, they'll naturally just be doing that without thinking it's too weird, perhaps.
One thing that I've noticed in my own journey is that, because I've done a little bit of that, I didn't use a rubber duck, but I basically I would have like an imaginary student that I was teaching, and I would pretend that what I just did that was incorrect was me providing an example of something that's incorrect, and then talk about like how to fix it. But what I found is that if I recorded like that session and then I went back and listened to that session, not only did I have the experience of messing it up, but then I had to sit there and listen to myself explain what I did and how to fix it. And it was almost like that was like the third or fourth time that I had experienced it. And by then I felt like that teenager who's like, Mom, I know, I'll wash the dishes. It was like so annoyingly repetitive by that point that it stuck a lot more deeply, and I found that the number of times that I had to experience it that way was far fewer than if I just played it and it didn't go well. If I played it and didn't go well, played it and didn't go well. So that's, I don't know. I find that like having to listen back to a recording that includes that stuff is also, helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah, I never thought about recording. Yeah, because you're right. You would then, well, I wonder if it would also be the case that you listen back and then you realize you're wrong, like your assessment of it was wrong. Maybe that wasn't what caused it. Or if you're videoing even, maybe when you watch back. Has that ever happened, Jason, where like he's like, oh, you know what, I identify, or I diagnosed the problem incorrectly?
Yeah, there's definitely times where you're like, maybe I was hard on myself, or no, I don't think that was it. That happens. And then the other way too, you might listen back to it, and you might realize that what you had said was not actually the thing that was wrong, that needs to be addressed. And so then that makes it stick more deeply as well. I like, it's a win-win no matter what. It's almost like no matter what the feedback is in the moment, you're either going to listen back to that and get, and have it be validating, or you're going to listen back to that and say, what was I thinking? But either way, it's like the fourth time that you're going to experience it. So, or third time, I guess, because you played it, you addressed it in the moment. So that's number 2. And then you went back and watched it. So that's number 3.
That actually reminds me of, so Jason Haheim's principal timpanist at the Med, and some of you might have heard podcasts we did recently where he talked about the importance of recording lessons, transcribing lessons in terms of learning. And this is something he and Anders Ericsson were actually doing research on until, unfortunately, Anders passed away last month. But yeah, I don't know, how many of you make your students record their lessons, and not only record them, but listen back and transcribe the lesson? Does anyone do that? It's pretty unusual. I think Jason did it for himself, but now he makes his students do this because essentially what happens is, without doing that, your students in the moment are so busy trying to play and trying to absorb something from what you're telling them and make adjustments in the moment, but so much of it gets lost. And so they end up bringing the same problems back and reinforcing those problems during the week because they've forgotten that they were supposed to do X, Y, or Z about XYZ problem. And so when students listen back to the recording, they get the chance to absorb more fully everything that was happening without the kind of nerves and just the pressure of having to play in the moment. but then they also become more adept at being their own teacher. Basically, it's like you're on their shoulder the whole week, because after they've transcribed it and it's like, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to focus on this, I need to remember to do this in this section. Like when they practice and when they play, like that's still kind of, you're still there through the week instead of you being kind of forgotten. Yeah, you become the ducky. And so what he found is that the retention is vastly greater. Like instead of, I mean, he just made up numbers to kind of go along with it, but I think he said something like, like retention is more like 80% of the things that you worked on, the things that you wanted to help them develop, as opposed to like maybe 20%, 10% retention, which then has this sort of, I know, Jason, you did that video where you had like decimals and productivity of practice with continuous days. It's sort of like that, like the progress from one week to the next in lessons is that much greater, because you don't have to repeat yourself and keep correcting the same things week after week, but they continue to build from one week to the next in a more efficient sort of way. So so that the podcast, I forget what week it was just like a few weeks ago. Jason talked about this. I'm assuming Jason Solomon is now Googling furiously to find that and post that in there somewhere. But
I was taking a break. I was actually just listening experience, but I can look up stuff. Sure, no problem.
Right. You don't have to. I can always send it.
One of the things that, because I think, Shelby brings up a great point, that, most of us teach, whether we're teaching ourselves or we're teaching other students to some degree, whether it's private or, in a university or a high school setting or whatever. And there's always that, challenge of, you can offer the greatest golden nuggets of wisdom, but then there's, a bit of a motivation. Sorry, New Jersey's calling me. Sometimes there's a bit of a challenge to really get them to like drink the water. Like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And there are definitely times where, because there's so many apps now, like the amazing slow downer apps and all that stuff. And so sometimes like in a lesson, I will like record a quick snippet of a student doing something, and then we will listen back to it together. And then I'll point out, be like, oh, did you hear that? Or you hear, and sometimes we'll have a good laugh over it. And sometimes it'll just be a way for me to show them how helpful it is. But I'm not at the point where I make that kind of stuff compulsory, because then that's yet another level that I would have to like grade. I would have to monitor that. And it gets to the point where if I'm trying to monitor so many things, it almost becomes cumbersome. So I don't know if you've had any experience, or if any teachers have shared with you kind of ways to kind of balance that. Because I think we all know that recording ourselves is important, and we all know that being mindful in that process is important. But at some point, if you practice for 4 hours and you record yourself for 4 hours and you listen to yourself for 4 hours and you reflect, you're now doing like 9-10 hours worth of work. So it does cut down in the amount of time, and there needs to be a good balance. I mean, what are some strategies that you or people you have worked with have kind of shared?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in the case of Jason, when he did this, he had a 9-to-5 job, plus, he was trying to balance that with Chicago Civic, and he was taking auditions. And so he would go, sometimes a couple months between lessons. And what he discovered without taping is that he would kind of go off in the wrong direction a little bit too far, kind of like walking in the woods without a compass. Like he wouldn't be able to self-correct quickly enough, and so he'd end up delaying the amount of work or progress that he could make over time. And so that made sense from then. And his students that come in and study or take lessons with him, same sort of thing. Like they're not necessarily weekly students, so they really need to get as much as they can out of the 2 or 3 hours that they spend with them. And so on a week-to-week basis, I think that is going to be a lot more challenging, especially from a motivation perspective. It might be that they're just partial moments of lessons that might be worth transcribing that are more important than others, maybe with regards to one excerpt or something like that, or one piece, perhaps, just that moment of it. The other thing that I heard that I liked in terms of recording yourself is, so Caroline Code is the third chair violist in the Detroit Symphony, and her rule for herself is 90 seconds. Because if you record more than 90 seconds of whatever it is that you're working on, that's going to take time to listen back to. And then because it takes too long to listen back to it, you're not going to do it. And so better to record something than nothing. And so maybe take the passage that seems to need the most work, or that you're most unsure about, or maybe the passage that you feel best about, just to kind of see where it really is, and then fit that into 90 seconds and then listen back, and then make that more of a habit first, just to kind of like this concept of Kaizen, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This idea of, instead of telling somebody, you know, you're going to die if you don't exercise because you just had a heart attack and you're out of shape and you need to work on cardiovascular fitness, they're not going to do it because it's too overwhelming a task, and your brain's just going to shut down after like a week of trying even. So the idea, he gave lots of examples in the book of, so for instance, he found, you know, one patient watched Jeopardy every evening at 5:30 or whenever it's on. And so he said, all right, so every time Jeopardy comes on, I want you to march in place for 30 seconds, and then you can sit down and watch the show. And then after a few weeks of that, that became pretty easy. And then he had her during commercial breaks. Okay, now I want you to march in place during the commercial breaks for 1 minute. And then that became pretty easy. And then eventually it turned to, you know, during the commercial, I want you to walk to the end of the driveway and then back in. And eventually it was walking around the block. And then it wasn't even tied to Jeopardy at all, but maybe after Jeopardy or before Jeopardy, go for an actual legit walk. And then that translates into more activity. But the idea might be to start even with just record yourself 30 seconds every morning after your warm-up before you've really practiced. And then once that becomes a habit, it might be easier to do 60 seconds or 90 seconds, or then just integrating recording more into daily practice. Because for me, I think from the mental perspective, the reason for recording isn't just to identify what needs work and what to problem solve and to be able to listen more carefully, but there's this notion of, so if you think about when you're practicing effectively, it requires a lot of self-monitoring, self-analysis, judgment, critique, problem solving. Like there's a lot that you need to think about to be able to problem solve and practice effectively. But if you think about an effective performance and where your mind is at in those moments, it's not in the same place that it's in when you're practicing, right? Like your mind's generally cleaner, or not cleaner, but clearer or quieter. You're more focused on the shape of the phrase or the kind of sound that you want, or these very kind of more abstract high-level things. And you're not self-monitoring and evaluating and judging and critiquing as much as intently as you would be if you're practicing. And so for me, the thing with recording is if you don't record, you don't have the ability to problem solve as effectively. Well, no, how do I say this? So if you're not recording, it means your brain kind of has to self-monitor and critique and analyze and judge. Otherwise, you're not going to be problem solving effectively. But in order to be able to perform effectively, we have to be able to shut off the critic in our head and the analysis and the coaching and the teaching and all that. And that requires practice because it's not normal to do that. And so that's where if you record yourself, you can defer or delegate all the self-analysis and judgment and monitoring to future you when you listen back to the recording. So it's kind of like you're practicing flipping the switch from practice mode to performance mode, and that's where the recording comes into play. And so daily practice of that, to me, I think is a really important skill.
You know, Noah, you're not really on Instagram, right?
No.
Yeah, I've done a little stalking and didn't see you there. One of the things that I've noticed is that there are a lot, because I recently started, you know, some people have recommended, oh, you should get on Instagram, and I hate social media, but I begrudgingly, you know, started that. And I've kind of connected with and started following like high school trombonists and, you know, undergraduate trombonists. And I would much rather follow kids that are posting little 30-second videos of their, you know, Roshu than, you know, watching like some principal trombonist have a barbecue, because like that doesn't interest me. But one of the things I'm noticing is that the kids these days, there are a lot of kids out there that have an Instagram account, and it's essentially a practice journal for them. They have an Instagram account and they post a little video of their playing every so often. And sometimes you'll run across these videos where, or, you know, kids will, you know, like some sophomore in some high school in Nebraska will say, oh, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't post a video yesterday. And in my mind, I'm thinking, who cares? Like nobody cares, you know, but in their mind, they've kind of embraced it as an important part of their, you know, their routine. And I think that could create a forum for really good, productive, you know, habits. If you're doing it just for validation from your other high school friends, I don't know if that's going to get you the results. If it does become a mechanism where, you know, people are kind of posting recordings regularly, people are giving meaningful discussion and content, or if you're just getting a chance to listen back yourself, it it seems like it could be something that musicians could really get into. So,
Yeah, yeah. Whatever makes it easy, I think, to develop a habit.
We've got another question in the chat, and if anyone else in the group has any questions, feel free to chime in or put them in the chat. But I'll read the question that we have here. It says, "What's the best and most convincing way to recreate an audition or performance experience? Running up a flight of stairs, meditation. I'd love to somehow have a full VR audition experience and practice getting better at that." Any thoughts or question? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a tough one, especially nowadays in this immediate moment. That's yeah. I was so one of my former pre-college students' mother is a physician here in the city, and she was starting to do some research on VR, and unfortunately I wasn't able to participate. Um, but that yeah, that is maybe the future. There's maybe a future there somewhere with VR because Aaron Williamon, who runs this performance research center in the UK, actually put together a oh, what's it called? Basically, like a audition simulator. Like had a screen with an audience, either with nodding along with smiles or like looking unhappy and frowning, and like he had these kind of different scripted responses from the audience, but also had like a warm up room, like a green room, like stage entrance, like so. And it turned out, I think, in the research that he did, that it's not even just so much the simulating the performance itself, but like the lead up to the performance, where the nerves kind of like start going from a simmer to kind of being on the front burner again, and so forth. So I think typically when they try to simulate nerves in sports research, it involves some competition, like with teammates. Like in a basketball free throw study, it would be, you'd have to shoot these free throws in front of your teammates, in front of coaches. It's going to be videotaped for analysis by like national team coaches or something like that. And there's something at stake even financially, right? Like, so you win money if you perform better. So those, like, think four key elements. So potential evaluation by people whose opinions matter to you, through videotape analysis after the fact, immediate kind of having an audience of peers or people whose opinions matter to you, and then there being kind of a competitive element perhaps, and then a prize or something at stake. So at least some of those can. I think playing for other people is one kind of constant that seems to help trying to simulate some of that. Playing for a bunch of different people that you know less well, more well, whose opinions matter more or less to you, different instrument groups, maybe friends of friends, and so forth, and doing a number of them. So, I mean, so David Kim, the concertmaster of Philadelphia, says he'll do 30 or 40 practice performances of a concerto before he'll play it with an orchestra, for different audiences all around the area. Um, Rob Knopper, percussionist at the Met, he did 42 mock auditions, one a day for 6 weeks in a row before his Met audition, just to, not just for habituating and kind of getting used to nerves, but to try different things every time. Like, one time it'll be like after running up and down a flight of stairs, so your heart's racing before you play something really soft and quiet, or might be doing a bunch of push-ups to make sure your hands feel a little bit shaky or your arms feel shaky. Might be after sitting in the car for an hour just with nothing to do, just so then you come out and you're feeling a little bit creaky and not warmed up. Um, yeah, so trying to change things up and vary things as much as possible so that whatever happens at the audition, ideally it feels easier than the kind of torture you've put yourself through in all your mocks in advance.
Are there any other questions that people have or want to jump in? I've got a couple of things I could ask, but I want to make sure everyone in the group has some time to ask.
Yeah, if I could jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do.
You're talking about recordings. For me, it was, I went through about probably 6 years of bad auditions playing Mozart Requiem. I had an audition, it didn't go right, and for 6 years I couldn't play it. It's an easy excerpt when you really think about it. And it was 100% mental. And I think I had the teachers who told me record. I've probably got 1,000 mini discs of Mozart Requiem sitting somewhere. If anyone's after some mini discs, and for me, the solution was actually to stop recording, and to stop. What happened to me was twofold. The teachers, the professors, because I got into idol worship of professors who get their jobs at 18 and never have failures, or they don't admit their failures. And the mental game of the mental game. I got too deep into reading every single book on the mental game to actually absorb it. Is there always a danger of something like that happening? Overly thinking things. In the end, what I did is I got into Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, in a game of tennis, the classic 1970s sports psychology books, to get rid of all that mental game,
Yeah.
and focus on body awareness.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, so one of the reasons why we tend to, so there's two exercises and a couple thoughts. One of the reasons why we tend to choke under pressure is we start consciously monitoring the mechanics of something that should be automated at that point. So it's like if you've ever been on camera and asked to sit naturally, suddenly you forget how to sit like a normal person, right? Like you don't know where to put your hands and sit forward or back, what to do with your legs, or to walk on camera. Suddenly you can't walk like a normal person either. So that's one of the reasons why we tend to choke. When things are automatic, we start either consciously monitoring or trying to control these things, which then leads to choking. And so the three things that tend to help with that is probably where you ended up, I'm guessing, Dominic. Focusing on the sound that you want, or focusing on pulse, kind of subdividing internally and thinking about pulse, or maybe focusing on being subtly improvisational in the moment, doing slightly different things with phrasing and shaping and so forth. Like focusing on those kind of high-level abstract things tend to be much more effective in performing the things that you've trained your body to do than thinking about the minutia of the movements involved in executing those things, which can sometimes happen when we get so into the mental side of things, or even kind of overthinking the mental side of things can be a little bit debilitating. And so there's two things that kind of occur to me that might be relevant to what you were describing, both of which, well, no, they don't both come from the diving world, but so in terms of getting past some of these mental blocks that we have of things that we can play but hear ourselves not playing effectively, there's a visualization exercise. Actually, yeah, there's a diving component to it. So Jeff Huber, I don't know, Jason, if you ever met him when you were at Indiana, but he was the diving coach there for many years. He told the story about a diver at the Olympic trials who was, veteran Olympian, was on the cusp of making the team again, and she would if she nailed her last dive. But if she messed up her last dive, she would go home. She wouldn't be on the Olympic team. And so he saw her, climbing up to the top of the platform, got about halfway, but then froze and just stopped. And he could tell even from the distance that just the blood drained from her face. She just looked shaken a little bit and got spooked. And so she stayed there for a while, but then eventually continued to walk up to the top. And by the time she got to the top, she looked like she was ready to nail the dive, and she did. And so he caught up with her later and asked her what happened. And she said, yeah, she did get spooked in that moment, because just flashed into her mind a moment where she messed that dive up and got hurt. So she had this sort of physical kind of traumatic experience with that dive, which kind of freaked her out a little bit. So then he asked her, well, what did you do to get back into the right headspace to be able to execute? She said, and this is easier said than done, but she said, well, she just remembered a few times in competition where she nailed that dive and she felt really strong and did that successfully. So she just flooded her mind with those images instead. And that's something you can practice, because in the moment, when you start worrying about, the worst possible scenario, it's really difficult to get your mind to turn around and go in the other direction. So there's this visualization exercise, a sports psychologist for the St. Louis Cardinals recommends, where you basically script out 60 seconds of highlights from your past performances or auditions. So it could be the Mozart Requiem, just doesn't have to be the whole thing, but just moments of it where you, in the past, actually did play it really, really well, had a good experience with it, and in a performance or studio class or mock audition or something, and then you just stitch together 60 seconds worth of highlights from past performances like that, and then really get in there and re-experience those for 60 seconds. And then you project those highlights onto maybe the biggest audition that you have coming up, and you just pre-experience that audition having all those same elements of your best performances in the past. And then the last 60 seconds is where you just project highlights onto day-to-day things like rehearsals and gigs and so forth. And so this 3-minute exercise, if you do this every morning, basically you're practicing recalling some of your highlights in the past, some of your best performance moments in the past, so that under pressure, backstage, or in the moment when you need those, you have gotten so good at recalling them that you can recall them and flood your mind with those kinds of positive performance images instead of having screwed up or imagining yourself messing up. So that's one thing. The other thing that Jeff had his divers do, well, some poor intern had to do, I think, and the divers just took advantage of it. Anytime they had, so they had 10 competition dives in their repertoire, basically, and anytime they had a new personal best of that dive, whether it was in practice or in competition or warm-ups, they took video of that dive and overwrote the previous personal best. So they have this very short videotape of the very best performance of each of their 10 competition dives that they can watch all the time. Like every day, they would just take this home with them, they'd watch it and remind themselves what their best diving performance looked like. And so they kind of even re-experience it mentally and visualize it emotionally, to kind of remember how it felt and see themselves doing it. This is something that if you record yourself pretty often would be useful to do too, basically saving all of your best takes and kind of having a playlist of the best take of each of the excerpts or the things that you're working on. Not that you have to listen to it every day, but just to kind of remind yourself what your best playing sounds like, so you can kind of help build confidence in that regard. There is some evidence from some research in swimming that watching yourself perform well actually leads to more rapid improvement. So they had the swimmers basically do a bunch of strokes, or like 10 freestyle strokes or something, and they took the best one of those 10 and they stitched it together so it looked like a continuous, seamless example of that particular stroke. They found the ones that watched that actually improved quicker and improved their technique more effectively than the ones who watched the best stroke in the kind of natural sequence of all 10, some of which were better, some of which were worse. You don't have to listen to it every day, but it may not hurt to listen to it occasionally, or watch it even occasionally.
Any other questions or thoughts you want to add in? And Noah, how are we with time? We've just gone a little past an hour.
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good
okay,
with time.
Okay. I mean, we can sort of keep going a bit longer too if we want, but I want to make sure everyone can ask the questions if they would like. One thing I just want to just throw in, what struck me about all of this is, and you're looking at a guy right now who had suffered from like incredibly debilitating stage fright early on in my career, and for a long time started to function on beta blockers really, and then really went into this long process of kind of studying psychology, because I felt, and no judgment against beta blockers for me at all, it's totally I have many colleagues who use them and don't. It doesn't affect any opinion of from my perspective of them. But I found I couldn't really. I felt I could not play my absolute best if I was using beta blockers. So it would kind of put me in the middle. Like I wouldn't crash and burn, but I wouldn't really achieve my highest level. So when I really started to kind of really study this stuff and really embrace the mental side of performance, and which is where I kind of got turned on to a lot of your work, Noah. What I found is that my perspective on what I had labeled nerves or stage fright shifted, and it became like a tool that I could use to enhance my performance and achieve a higher level. And I came to actually rely on that adrenaline or that stress response to help me, and it became in a weird way a friend. I knew I'd come full circle when a couple years ago I went through a period of about 6 months where I didn't get nervous. and it kind of freaked me out. And I remember getting worried, like maybe I should stop playing trombone, you know. And I remember I was playing Brahms too in Charleston, and we get to the last page, and everything's kind of heating up, and you got to play a high D really loud, and it's just you coming up at the end, you know. And I felt like this like rush of like adrenaline nerves, and I was like, yes, finally, you're back, you know. And so that, I think you could just think of that as a hopefully a testimonial that it could totally change your perspective on it. That was what was really for me the most empowering aspect of all of this.
Yeah, that's a great story. There's a lot of research actually on, because when we talk about anxiety and nerves, it's actually, there's a physical component, there's a mental component, and the mental component's effect on performance and the physical component's effect on performance is not the same actually. There are different relationships, and so there's this kind of there's a variety of theories that kind of overlap, but basically, physically speaking, the relationship between physical activation and performance seems to be like that inverted U, right? So like too little's no good, a moderate amount is good, and that varies from person to person where optimally you'd be on that. And then too much, obviously, if you're bouncing off walls, that's not generally great for performance either. But mentally speaking, it's like the more cognitive anxiety there is, the worse. So that's a very linear curve, right? So the less cognitive anxiety or worries or doubts or fears there are, the better performance is, and the more, the worse things tend to go. And that element of performance anxiety is actually more predictive of performance, generally speaking, than the physical element. So yeah, so what you're describing, I mean, there's this research on, threat versus challenge states and so forth, and even research where they found that people who did this karaoke thing, who said, I'm excited before performing for this audience, scored higher than people who said, I'm anxious, regardless of what they were feeling internally. So being able to embrace, like David was saying, the physical activation as excitement does seem to be more facilitative to optimal performance than trying to fight it or trying to control it and attributing it to nerves.
Okay, go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I had a general question because, by the way, I follow your stuff and I love it. Thank you for what you do for this community and all the Bulletproof Musician. It's great. I'm curious on how much I read stuff like the yips with tennis or with golf more particularly, and I guess my own personal pitfall is that a few months ago I had to do Bolero and I could not miss it. I was going and I did it and I killed it. But if I get into an audition situation, it's right there when I get not in on the stage, but you hear the people warming up. I lack that mental capacity to switch. And you're talking about the cognitive anxiety. How do you go about controlling that? Because in most situations, I kind of am anxiety ridden in general, but I know how to zero in on most things. Concertos, big performances. There's just something that is in the air that's different about the competition of the audition, at least for me.
Yeah, this is something that you probably talk in various ways for hours about, but I think it's easier for a lot of folks to rise to the occasion in performance because it's like, I can't think of the right example. Parade is not it, but like, you know what I mean? Like everything's on motion. You're just kind of jumping onto the train at the right time, and everything's kind of already in motion, and it helps. It's like riding the wave in a way. Whereas in an audition, it's all kind of initiated by you, and that's all that's going on, and there's different kinds of pressure and so forth, and it's a very odd sort of feeling environment. Which is where, so I was listening to this Freakonomics podcast maybe a few months ago, and Olympic gymnast Shawn Johnson was on, and I don't know if you've heard me tell the story, but I was fascinated by what she had to say because I'd never heard an athlete describe it in these terms. Basically, she said that she needed to automate the physical script or the physical choreography of the routine, obviously, right? That has to be on autopilot where you can execute it without thinking about what move comes next. But she said that she also needed to come up with and choreograph and practice a mental script of thoughts to basically know what exactly she was going to think about from one moment to the next throughout this 90-second floor routine. Because if she didn't have this scripted set of thoughts to engage in, her mind would naturally go to worrying about getting injured or screwing up or what the judges are going to score her as or what her competitors were doing and so forth. And so the same thing, I think, relates to musicians, especially in an audition situation, not so much necessarily on stage in a performance, but in an audition. So knowing exactly what to think about when you're backstage about to go on, what you're thinking about when you walk out on stage, what to think about when you put your music down, what to think about in the 30 seconds before you play that first excerpt, and then throughout the excerpt, what are you thinking about from moment to moment, and then afterwards, immediately after playing, what do you think about? And it doesn't have to be, I'm going to think about French fries for the next 20 seconds, and then I'm going to think about, right, it's not like random things. It's about checking in with your body, maybe to make sure you're in the right physical state, this muscle group or that muscle group, making sure you're focused on X number of breaths before the first excerpt, with a count of this on the way inhale and a count of this on the exhale perhaps. And as you're playing the excerpt, again, those three things, what sorts of improvisational details do you want to add in here? What kind of subdivisions are you going to be using in this measure versus that measure? What kinds of sounds you're going to be focused on? What part of the orchestra are you going to be focused on hearing in your head as you're playing this moment? So there's, just a few specific things, but potentially a rich kind of tapestry of thoughts and scripted thoughts that you can engage in that basically reduce the amount of cognitive bandwidth that you have available to think thoughts that could derail your performance or make you nervous or be aware of the committee or the people backstage or the people that you ran into in the warm-up room and so forth. And that's something that, again, must be practiced in advance, obviously weeks, maybe even months in advance, where you get comfortable with your script and you trust your script when you're playing for colleagues and friends of colleagues and so forth. So it's a kind of a pain. It's a lot to do, but it's something that with a little bit of practice and time, I think becomes kind of a comforting place to put your mind and your thoughts where you know what, if I focus on these things, I sound good. I've sounded good in the practice room recording myself. I've sounded good playing for this person who generally freaks me out. I've sounded good playing for these three people who I know I care a lot about their opinion. It just works if I do these things. That's sort of the Cliff's Notes version of my answer to that question. But hopefully there's some clarity there that you can turn into some action.
I think one aspect that also kind of helped me bridging all of this, which you kind of touched on just now, Noah, was that I think it's sometimes a little tempting for us to kind of think of mental training as something we can sort of whip out in the concert. Like, I do all this practice and then now I'm going to go in there and think these things and it's going to work. But when I kind of started to realize that you really have to practice it, like the centering, I practiced that for probably 45 minutes a day for about 3 or 4 weeks before I could really get, and all this was 7 or 8 steps like that you have in your process. I started to kind of over that be able to boil them down into like a 15-second thing that I go and then execute. But it was like something I had to practice as diligently as like scales or range exercise in the instrument. It was like I had a really, so in a way there's a physicality of mental training, if that makes any sense.
Totally. Yeah, it's easy to try to look for these kind of little hacks that you can implement in the moment, and there are some, but they take practice and cultivating and developing and trusting. So.
It is kind of funny how people that start getting into mental practice, they usually start getting into mental practice when there is a quote unquote problem. Like they've done the physical practicing and they've reached a certain level in their playing, and then they try to take auditions or whatever, and it doesn't go very well. So then they're like, okay, so now I'm going to start doing physical practice. And it's almost as if like, 7th grader plays a row shoe etude and it doesn't go well. And they're like, all right, enough of that. That didn't work. They don't give themselves the same freedom to experience the journey of improvement of mental practice. Like Dave said, like it's something that you have to practice, and there are going to be adjustments to it, and there are times where you're going to try it a certain way and it's not going to go well, but that's of the process in that.
maybe before we wrap up, well, are there any other questions? Shout them out.
I had one more quick one.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any suggestions for, like, I really like the Insight app, Insight Timer for meditation. Kenny Werner's Effortless Mastery has a really good guided thing for musicians as well. I do well at that type of thing, and I think those really help me as well at auditions when I need to. It's somehow assisted to zone in at the moment. Is there anything like that? Does Bulletproof Musician have anything like that for these kind of guided exercises?
Bulletproof Musician does not, but some of my students have talked about an app called Musician's Hypnosis, which is, I don't think hypnosis, but it's like a guided meditation that they seem to like. I actually, to be honest, haven't listened to it yet, but if you haven't tried that, that's something to look into perhaps.
I just listen to Beastie Boys at auditions. That's my getting into flow.
Yeah.
I've made it all down into the first couple of minutes of Beastie Boys, and so I've turned, it was actually Kenny Werner, the whole hour, into really just something that switches me onto it.
Yeah, I think music of other kinds can be great too. Yeah, so I have a viola friend who, she's this really petite, sweet. I say girl because we met in college. Lady, I suppose, is more accurate. But she uses the mantra "badass" and listens to the Game of Thrones theme song like on loop before she goes into auditions or performances, just to remind herself of that sort of energy. And yeah, what was the other?
I was doing Eminem for a while. And it's funny because I used to like make little like recordings of like the audition list, and I would like listen to Brahms while I'm in the warm-up room, and I realized that was a horrible idea in hindsight. And so then I started doing like, I would listen to Eminem, or I would listen to I stretch a lot, and I have stretch playlists, so like what my students would call like old people music, but just like stuff that really chills me out. I would listen to that in the warm-up room, and that was a game changer. So that little Eminem, good to go,
One thing that you can experiment with too, one last thing, is coloring books. Not for like, your kids and Dora the Explorer, but like the ones that are kind of intricate for adults, and you can get colored pencils that are nice. And so the principal cellist of the Boston Symphony, like when he won his audition, that's how he occupied himself backstage, just to kind of, keep his mind sort of engaged and not wandering, but not something that he couldn't just drop and leave immediately when he needed to. And I've recommended that to a few other people, and they seem to find that helpful. I can sort of see there's a little bit of research that calms you down, so it's not completely just random, but it's another
Side note on that, and I don't know if I don't have any evidence about this, but I've been told this, that when the process of writing, your brain waves change or something. It's different than typing or something like that. And I don't know what the research is, but I think that's why a lot of people find journaling very effective, because there's like a symbolic element of taking an idea in your head and physically manifesting it on paper. But there's also like something I find when I write things physically, something about cursive too. I hear people saying you should write your goals in cursive. I don't know why. So that's like an area I don't really know much about. But I do feel that when I'm writing stuff, so maybe like drawing like that, there's something, my brain does feel different. I don't really know why.
I think that part of it, because I've looked into that as well, and I think part of it is if you grew up in a generational time where you learned penmanship and writing in cursive, then that will affect you. The kids these days, a lot of them are doing far less work with handwriting because they're getting to typing sooner. So I don't think it would have the same benefit for them. But I think if you grew up at a time where you wrote a lot, it would make a difference. Personally, that's what I've found in what I've kind of studied. And to go back to Tyler's situation, I did want to throw in just a quick kind of kinesiology thing about that, which is more of my particular area of background. There is a lot of research out there that looks at like people with depression, for example, and our bodies in a way kind of take little snapshots in time and can physically hold on to even traumatic experiences or negative experiences in a postural way, where like resting muscle lengths actually change a little bit, and we actually kind of like create a snapshot of like those moments. And so sometimes what can happen is if you have a traumatic moment, like let's say you crash and burn in a performance, your body can actually physically remember that posture and like the way that your body was kind of situated. So one of the ways that you can kind of mitigate that is if you do more things like stretching or like yoga and actually kind of reset physically, the way that the body is kind of aligned. And I know Alexander technique goes in that direction as well. But so Tyler, but I guess for everybody, one of the things that I have found in my own journey is that if I developed a lifestyle habit of, knowing how to get my body to physically be in a good place and reset and relaxed, and then I'm able to figure out a way to visit that space very quickly. And so, for example, I tried to get to the point where in 3 breaths, can I get to the point where I am at my most relaxed state, similar to like I've been stretching for an hour and I'm super relaxed. I try to get to the point where physically I can get there in like 3 breaths. Or is there a certain song that I can listen to like a measure, or like a line of, and kind of get to that physical space. And so just getting my body to that physical state then made it so that my mental thoughts flowed very easily in the direction I wanted them to. But if I wasn't physically calibrated in that relaxed way, I was just trying harder and harder to not think about a pink elephant in the room. I just like mentally, I couldn't get the job done. So I had to kind of start with that physical sense. For me, that was a real game changer. So.
Maybe before we wrap up, or if anyone has other questions, shout them out. But maybe Noah, can you tell us where we can find you, and if people want to learn more about your stuff and reach out to you if they want more information?
Yeah, so bulletproofmusician.com is where the blog lives. There's ways of finding the podcasts in iTunes or however it is that people get podcasts. But yeah, if you just go to bulletproofmusician.com, that's the easiest way to find me, I think. And you can ask questions and send me an email if something comes up. But yeah.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you so much for
thanks for having me.
Yeah, coming to and share your thoughts with us. This is really wonderful. And yeah, I can't tell you how much your all of this whole topic and all of your work on this has really helped me in my career. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
All right.
Okay.
Well, everyone go forth and do your thing, try to go change the world. And but by all means, if you have any suggestions, or if you are interested in us taking the boat in any certain direction, we thought the summer would be a really great time to kind of experiment with getting a little bit more out of the box in terms of people that we have coming in and sharing insight. So if that's working for you, we could do more of that. But let us know. Feedback is helpful for us as well. So we want to make this work for all of us. But thank you, Noah, for sharing with us today, and thanks everyone for being here.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right. Be well. Thanks. Cool. Cool. I'll stop recording now.